Welcome back to the podcast for Cultural Reformation, brought to you by the Ezra Institute.
Welcome back, one and all. This is the podcast for Cultural Reformation, brought to you by the Ezra Institute. I'm Ryan Aris. I am here with Dr. Joe Boot, and we've got special guest Dr. Aaron Edwards with us today. Aaron is the author of several books, A Theology of Preaching and Dialectic. He's co-editor of the T&T Clark Companion to the Theology of Kierkegaard, and the author of Taking Kierkegaard Back to Church. Aaron is a self-described theologian in academic exile, and we're going to get to where that phrase comes from in our conversation today. He also blogs at thatgoodfight.com and is co-host of Pod of the Gaps. That's a podcast on the intersection between church and contemporary culture. Aaron, it's terrific to have you on the show. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Ryan. Yeah, good to be here. Love what you guys are doing.
Oh, well, we're very much looking forward to this conversation. So regular listeners will know that we are on a bit of a summer mini-series on issues facing the church. Today, we've got Aaron on to speak to the theme of Christian cowardice. We want to look at and analyze where and why the church has failed to speak out prophetically to the culture on key issues, and the areas where they do speak out, there's often it often takes the form of simply restating or assuming mainstream cultural assumptions, or there is this sort of posture of masochistic navel gazing where the church will say, or evangelicals have failed to love the culture, and so is it any wonder that they don't want to listen to us? We haven't been winsome or irenic or gentle and lowly enough. So these are the two approaches that we often see amongst evangelicals when they do speak to culture. Aaron has been advocating for and living out an alternative, which is what we'd want to hear from you about today, Aaron. A Christian way to fight, to bring the a holy and godly attitude of combativeness to the cultural issues of our day. So I'm going to turn it over to Joe to get into some of the specific questions, and this is the course that our conversation, Lord willing, is going to take today.
Thanks, Ryan. Yes, it's good to be with Aaron in the UK, and to have this opportunity to continue our series. And I think so far, Ryan, we've dealt with. I think this is maybe our third in
That's
this
right.
series as we deal with the issues. And I think last week we were looking at so-called Christian socialism. And
Yes.
This week, Christian cowardice, question mark, because it's something of an oxymoron. But let's get straight into this discussion while we've got Aaron with us today. Aaron, I certainly have watched with great interest over the past year, thereabouts, the development of your ministry and the issues that you have been and challenges that you have faced as a Christian teacher, as a Christian scholar, and actually I have at least something of a vague connection even to your situation, because my master's degree was many years ago was done at the college where you were a professor. So just to introduce you to our listeners, can you tell us something of just a little bit about your story over the last number of years, your sort of Christian journey to being a professor at Cliff College, and then tell us what actually happened. What is it that kind of, to some degree, actually, Aaron, has sort of propelled you to greater visibility within the Christian community in the UK over the past 12 months or so? What actually happened at Cliff College, which makes our discussion today so relevant. Can you start with something of your story and then bring us right up to date with what took place?
Sure. Yeah, happy to do that. And just for those, those who are watching the video, I'm so sorry I forgot to wear my check shirt, because clearly that was the uniform for the day. Sadly, I
You
didn't I
missed
didn't
the
get the
memo.
winsome memo. Yeah, that's right. I'm so going to be on winsome now. It's sticking out like a sore thumb. So yeah. So basically, my story. Thank you for those introductions, and I think it is interesting that you found my first introduction to you, Joe, was the then acting principal of Cliff College when I first arrived 7 years ago, handing me a copy of your book, The Mission of God, which you'd actually given him a kind of signed something which had some message in it, which said something like, enjoying your, in honor of your kind of awkward conversations you guys used to have, or the interesting debates, etc. And I think he certainly spoke well of you as a person, but it was just, I think, Aaron, I think you'll probably get on better with this than I will. He wanted to read it, so I was like, okay, I'll have a look. I had to skim through. I go, God, this is strong stuff for a winsome evangelical in Britain. But it was, yeah. So my journey at Cliff started, I guess, before I got into academia. I felt God kind of calling me into it, but not certainly with my eyes open all the way. Like, I've not really ever had a love of academia per se. I'll be very reluctant academic in the sense that I just felt God calling me into it. Of course, I love thinking and reading and writing, and doing kind of deep level study. But I always saw what the problems were with academia, with the way it becomes idolatrous, the way in which, in the modern version of the academy, it sucks the life out of people's faith. I often, all my degrees were not done at Bible colleges; they were done at universities. And I remember thinking I would never tell someone to go to university to study the Bible, to go and learn more about God's word. That is not going to happen. I mean, maybe there's other Christian universities in the US or Canada, maybe, or maybe not Canada actually, where that kind of thing might be possible. But in the UK, it feels like that it often felt like you're just battling against the stream. That was kind of good for me in some ways. It kind of prepared me for other debates and battles I would be having further on. But I certainly wasn't ever thinking, this wonderful, glorious academy where we can don these wonderful, weird hats and gowns and profess over these people in this wonderful way. I remember doing my PhD at University of Aberdeen, and I had some, not all, but some fellow PhD students who seemed to have a bit of an idolatry of academia, and if they didn't get a job at the end of it at an institution, they felt like they'd have failed. And I really wasn't being pious when I was saying to them, honestly, if you end up working at a coffee shop with a PhD and God wants you to be there, and that would be some weird thing that God might do to humble you, that would be good. And you can be the weird person who makes coffee for people, evangelizes to your colleagues, and happens to have a PhD and maybe writes books on the side. That's fine. You don't, you're Christian. You're following God. You're dead to this world. So if it doesn't actually matter, if you have to follow a certain course of action. So that's kind of the way I went into it, and I actually felt God stirring me halfway through my PhD to really pursue academia. So you'd think that you would pursue academia before you start a PhD, but it took me a while while I was into it to realize, this is where I actually want you to carve out a path here. So I had to take that a bit seriously. When I finished, I did get a job at the university as a temporary teaching fellow for a year, which was great fun, teaching a massive class of mostly non-Christians on theological issues and general religious topics. And then I got a full-time position at Cliff College in 2016, which was going to be an interesting kind of culture change because it was an evangelical college. Of course, Joe having been there presumably about 5 or 6 years earlier. I can't remember when you were there, but it was certainly before my time. And I came in as the program lead of the MA mission, the actual program that you did actually when you were at Cliff. And so overseeing that for 7 years, taking great interest in the students there and trying to shape the program in a more overtly evangelical direction. I think some kind of sloppy of a lot of the emerging church nonsense had come in for a while. I think Joe had to suffer under some of that in his time. And I tried to make a more robustly evangelical program that was actually culturally engaging and actually just theologically engaging, because there were some issues there of just general, some of the university nonsense had kind of been creeping in. And I kind of thought, well, Bible colleges, evangelical theological colleges are supposed to be different. They're supposed to have something distinctive about them. And so, yes, we do the critical level study, but we don't need to kind of drink the Kool-Aid of the kind of cultural downstream postmodernism, which was rife and still is in many respects, even though people don't use the word postmodernism. It's done its work. It's had its way in the theological academy, and still really the fruit of that's still evident. And so anyway, so I find myself at Cliff working away there, lots of challenges along the way. There's loads of stuff going on that I'm kind of battling behind the scenes. But generally speaking, things are going well. But I'm clearly cognizant of the fact that we were linked into British Methodism. And British Methodism is unlike global Methodism in that it's pretty much apostate now. And it's kind of accepted so much progressive false teaching over the years that it became really difficult to break free of that. So because the college I was part of, Cliff, was connected to them and financially dependent upon them, that was always going to cause some issues. But I was challenging some of the ways that the college was wanting to respond to Methodism, and I think falling on deaf ears. I think increasingly Methodism's grip upon the college whilst I was there increased significantly, very different to when even I first arrived. As always with some of this institutional rot, it kind of has an effect on these sister partner institutions, and the gangrene. I think of Paul warning against Hymenaeus and Philetus because their doctrine is like gangrene, and you need to cut it off, avoid it, and it's very hard to do that when you're kind of connected into it. So I think that was a sad thing that happened with the college. It used to have a reputation as a real evangelical bastion, in spite of the problems in Methodism, and then it became kind of almost subsumed into it over time. And I could see that happening, but we were fighting against the stream. Me and some other colleagues who had similar views to mine, but eventually it feels like that battle may well be lost, sadly. And it came to a head with this tweet I put out in February. I'd already been, I think as Ryan already intimated, I'd already been speaking about recovering Christian militancy for a while. And saying we need to speak out about these things that haven't been spoken out about. We really need to recover that. I've been doing that for a couple of years beforehand, out there on social media quite a lot, blogs, podcasts, tweets, etc. This one just happened to be one that went viral, basically, and people jumped on it. It was, and the tweet was, homosexuality is invading the church. Evangelicals no longer see the severity of this because they're busy apologizing for their apparently barbaric homophobia, whether or not it's true. This is a gospel issue, by the way, because if sin is no longer sin, we no longer need a savior. So I was wanting to challenge, really, evangelicals who are being too irenic and wanting to say, well, I technically agree that this is a problem, that, same-sex blessings in the Church of England or British Methodist Church voting on equal marriage, as they call it. Same-sex marriage is allowed at the same time as a traditional view. You can also have a progressive view, and that was voted on a couple of years ago. All these things happening, and for me, it's really clear that this is the time to speak out. For many evangelicals, it isn't, and they'll say, "Oh no, we mustn't." So we'll get onto that, I'm sure, in a moment. But that tweet caused a massive tweet storm. All the progressive, secular LGBT folk jumping on it, but also loads of Methodists, some of whom I knew, some of the leaders with the Methodism who I'd chatted with over time. They knew my view, I knew their view. We disagreed, but we weren't unfriendly to one another. Suddenly the unfriendliness came out, and I think it all kind of went a bit mad. I came back from church after that tweet had gone out on this Sunday. It was a scheduled tweet, so I kind of forgot that it happened, really. 25,000 people had been swarming around it, going crazy. The college denounced it publicly, saying this is unacceptable, inappropriate language. It doesn't reflect our views or ethos as a college. I remember thinking, wow, this is interesting. I haven't even been spoken to, and I've already been denounced by my employer without wanting a conversation. The next day, they emailed me. They had actually emailed me on the day. I hadn't checked my work email. They didn't call me. They just denounced me publicly. They thought that was an appropriate way to do it. And then they said, you need to take this down. Basically, we ask at this point you take it down because you violated our social media policy. I said, I don't think I have. Read the social media policy. It doesn't defame anyone. It wasn't extremist language. I hope you don't think that's extremism or hate speech. It's not homophobic. It's just denouncing the sin of homosexuality being tolerated in the church. It's an invasion because it's come from outside. It's come from the world. The world went rainbow crazy, and so then the church goes, "Oh yeah, let's do some new exegesis off the back of that." I wonder if it's got anything to do with what happened in the world. It's just obvious. It's not even, to me, it's not even slightly controversial what I said. And what they did is they then suspended me immediately without a conversation. I said, "I can't take the tweet down in good conscience. You should know that, because you can see what's happened around it. I've been denounced and I've been the victim of hate, if anyone has been here. And I'm not taking it down. But I'd welcome a conversation. So let me know when that conversation is going to happen." I then get summoned to a meeting later in that day by the principal, and I'm read my suspension letter. So it's just not a conversation. He says, literally opens the meeting, "This isn't going to be a conversation. I'm going to read your suspension letter, then you can ask some questions of clarification around the process." And it comes to the end of this, was about 4 p.m. The meeting lasted about 4:30, and I had then have half an hour. I've got till 5 p.m. to leave the premises, and if I don't, I'll be escorted from my office at 5 p.m. according to procedure and protocol. And I was literally listening to the going, I couldn't believe it, because I've seen over years so many, just in this very, very kind of liberal world we live in, it's almost hard to discipline. You almost think we need to be more disciplinarian. With so many things, I've thought, this is a real problem. This person's gotten away with that. I can't believe this. I can't believe that, within Methodism and other situations. And then suddenly, what I've done, immediately they kind of, the bricks come down upon you straight away. You're going to have to leave, as though you're kind of harmful to the students. We couldn't possibly have you on site influencing anyone, because you're such clearly such a criminal. We've got to get you off site by this point. So that kind of happened. I then actually tweeted the fact that I've been suspended, and then I often share that this is a bit like the I didn't have much support from my British evangelicals early on. And then, just like the Second World War, the Americans came in and helped late, but effectively. And so I tweeted, "Yes, I've been suspended for this tweet by an evangelical college, for Cliff College." And suddenly we went from 25,000 people to 300,000 people, but most of them in support of me and against the college. So I kind of think, actually, what happened, the college almost backed the wrong tweet storm. And I eventually, 2 weeks later, got fired, as was expected. After disciplinary process, got fired for bringing the college into disrepute. And I think the irony of it was just bizarre. And I mentioned this to the principal at the disciplinary hearing, saying, you must realize that you've brought the college into greater disrepute than whatever you think I've done. Because what you've done, you've told the entirety of evangelicalism that this evangelical expression on these issues is not safe. This is not a safe space. So they did say the college is a safe space for diverse views, in trying to sort of defend the progressives, but not realizing that obviously it's a hostile space for somebody who expresses strongly evangelical views. So it probably gets into all the stuff you mentioned earlier there, Joe, around the kind of irenic place we are in as evangelicalism, that it wasn't even imagined that someone could be evangelical, have the view, and say it like I said it, because we've almost gotten used to not being able to speak like that. So I'll probably hand over to you if you want to ask any follow-ups from there, but I've just talked a long time, so I thought I'll hand over the baton temporarily if you want to jump in on anything.
No, we appreciate the clarity around that. I think it was 2010 actually that I finished my master's degree with the University of Manchester through Cliff College, and even back then there was this invasion, as you said, of the emergent movement of strands of what I would call liberal thinking. And certainly among faculty, I wasn't the favorite the master's student. That's true.
I can well imagine.
There was some very interesting discussions and debates. But you've set a very interesting stall out there, because not only have you told us a bit of your own story, but in some respects you've described quite effectively the broader state of evangelicalism within Britain, something that is fairly common now, a fairly consistent pattern throughout much of the West. Certainly the story would be very, very similar in Canada, and obviously depending on which state you're in the United States. But you've actually given us a real insight there into the evangelical movement across Britain, especially in that you were so short of allies and friends. Can you give us a bit of an insight into what is the root of this problem? I mean, we're in a situation where supposedly what was, and it certainly trumpeted this when I was there, that this was one of the remaining faithful evangelical institutions in Britain, with a high quality, offering high quality degrees through one of the best universities for theology, anyway, in the country at the time.
Mm.
And so, a reputable institution. And in a situation like this, you've got a popular professor like yourself, well received by the students, saying something that's basically rudimentary, elementary evangelical teaching about marriage and human sexuality, and stating an undeniable, I mean, an absolutely undeniable fact. Not only actually have we seen the church invaded by homosexuality or homosexualization of the church, we've just had a trans archdeacon appointed for the Church of England in Manchester. I mean, there was nothing controversial about the tweet. It was a statement, quite frankly, no disrespect, of the obvious. It was a challenging tweet, but you weren't giving people a prophetic revelation about the state of the church, which is why, in some respects, you viewed it as so innocuous. I mean, we all know that homosexuality as an ideology now is invading the church, and Christians need to be asking themselves some questions about this. That's the kind of thing that the average American evangelical would think is a falling off a log type of obvious tweet that is incredibly non-controversial. How did we get, Aaron, to a situation where Christian institutions are so terrified of the culture or of the woke mob within their own institutions that they would rather, in cowardice, in fear, fire their best professors, maneuver them out of the college, than actually stand with their professor and the basics of Orthodox Christian teaching? What is the root of this kind of cultural cowardice that in an evangelical institution won't stand with basic evangelical doctrine? How do we account for that in your view?
Yeah, no, really, really good question, and it gets into the huge distinction between US and UK evangelicalism. So, because we're weaker as the church in many respects in the UK, because we just don't have as many people, or I don't want to get into kind of differences of strength and weakness in terms of discipleship levels or whatever. Some of those things, some of the fruit of the church is not always as visible as we'd like it to be, or want it to be. I think clearly there's just a lot more going on in the US, and what there isn't in the UK is a strong Christian right. We don't have that. The people on the right tend to be the complete weirdos, and they're so fringe and not really doing anything of any note whatsoever, and genuinely might have actually weird views. Or you have this sort of the right, the conservatives are either already quite soft on stuff, or those who are still pretty right of center are irenic and don't want to speak about it. In the US, it's very different, and we've already given away so much in the UK. So the evangelical churches and Bible colleges already have given up stuff to feminism for years and don't think of it as controversial. So they've already started to set something in, and they may still be solid on LGBT stuff. They're really clear on that, but they've already been softened. So by these other fears of all these other people who are going to tell them off, other Christians is often as powerful, more powerful perhaps even than what the world might say. And so because we've got evangelicalism as a whole, as a big blob, has been shifted to the left, that's been a huge problem. And of course that happens in the US as well, and other Anglophone contexts. And so it is an issue everywhere. But it's just something that we don't actually have the numbers, and we don't have a really strong sense of how to be reflective, but also really hold the line on these things. Whereas I think over in the UK, it does seem like, we reflection is almost seen as something that ought to move you to the left theologically, sociopolitically, in every respect. So if you're reflective, you obviously would go along with this way of doing stuff and this kind of doctrine or this way of thinking. Otherwise, obviously, you're either stupid or you just don't really love people very much. You don't care about people. Whereas in other contexts, there's a stronger, genuine, reflective and thoughtful version of the right. There's unthoughtful versions of the right in North America, of course there is, but there's a lot of a broader spectrum, strangely, as much as you have those issues of the left, even worse in some ways, in a more extremist way in the US, you have a strong response to that as well, which we don't have that. So partly for many years, that's why this is an issue, why the Americans on this, if not my tweet, were like, what? This is obvious. But many British people are like, ooh, bit spicy, a little bit too far. I wouldn't say that. It's a bit concerning. So you say, Joe, that, Cliff was a reputable institution, and that perhaps is the whole problem. What we're worried about our reputation, aren't we? And this is just something that all Christians as individuals can be concerned about. Jesus tells us to die, to take up our cross, to lose our life that we might save it. Paul says that I'm crucified to the world, and the world is crucified to me. I think many institutions that are Christian are not crucified to the world, because they are dependent upon their reputation in the eyes of the world. Because that reputation brings them money, it brings them a certain kind of fame, it brings them a kind of credence amongst the literati and the elite. And so it just becomes one of those things. I wasn't opposed to us having good reputation. I don't think it's, you shouldn't have a deliberately bad reputation amongst people. You would hope that any reasonable person would see the things you're doing and go, this is good. This is an honorable, good thing to do. We should pursue truth. Most of the ancient universities have some version in their kind of crest of arms of the pursuit of truth. That's usually the point of what a university exists for. Now, when in the postmodern world, the universities have increasingly become anti-truth, post-truth, opening the notion of truth up and even talking about truth as though it's something that is almost an ideology, as though truth were an ideology. It has this downstream effect. And so when you want to be reputable to those people and to those that kind of way of thinking, you're going to end up in really ridiculous places where you're going to give more and more away of the crown jewels that you possess, the things that you believe, the things that God has given us to hold on to and defend. Like when Paul speaks of guarding the good deposit we've been given, we just don't do that because the money's at stake, the reputation's at stake, and let's just play this political game. And if we, even though it's dragging us in this direction, maybe if we just hold on a bit longer, that reputation's so helpful. It's so great to have a university degree, a Bible college being validated by a university degree. And eventually you just give away more and more. And that's kind of where we're at. And so that the people being trained at these institutions that are already scared and fearful, what kind of pastors is that going to produce? What kind of missionaries? They're going to be equally concerned for their reputation. They're not going to say stuff in the pulpit that's going to get them in trouble. They're not going to say stuff in interviews. They're going to say, let me find a way of saying it that's going to take the edge off. Let me do an edit of the Bible. And let me just say, actually, the Bible writers are a little bit of their time. They're a little bit spicy, a bit salty. I've got a better way of doing it. I've learned winsomeness. I've learned how to put it in a way where the world isn't going to find it a problem anymore. And they're going to just welcome me with open arms, because that's what evangelicals are supposed to do. We're going to share the good news. So we want to win people. We want to sell the gospel. We want to sell Jesus to people. And I just think, in the end, it ends up, you end up losing huge elements of the huge aspects of the gospel in the process.
So on that, this kind of notion, and we hear it often, that if you are clear, if you're direct, it's as though there's an 11th commandment now within the evangelical community, which is thou shalt not offend anybody, and that somehow that if you are, if your tone is right and if you're not shrill, so if you're direct and clear, you're shrill, and there's a problem with tone. But if somehow you're vague, you're ironic, and I want to get you to comment on that in just a sec, then you can somehow, the idea seems to be that somehow you can actually navigate around the offense of the gospel. There seems to be this bizarre idea that the offense of the gospel isn't the content of the gospel of the kingdom. It's just the way you articulate it. So if you articulate biblical truth and the gospel of the kingdom in this winsome, ironic way, then people are going to like you. They're going to appreciate you. It's going to be winning. If you are, on the other hand, direct and clear and unequivocal, which seems to me the way that the Apostle Paul is and the Lord Jesus is and the prophets are, then this is different, of course, from being rude and abrasive. I mean, we don't want to make the offense of the gospel the fact that I can't use dignified language when I communicate, that I can't be respectful. I mean, the Apostle Peter enjoins the church, with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience. When we share the hope that's in us and when we make our defense. But there's no notion ever in the apostles or in the prophets or in the Lord Jesus of equivocation, or of the notion that basically the offense of the gospel is contained in the tone or in the peculiar way in which you might communicate this. And it seems to me that lots of evangelicals are being basically hung out to dry on the basis that they're clear, faithful evangelicals being hung out to dry on the basis that they got their tone wrong. So can you just help us understand what does this ironic winsomeness sound like, and why is that not the solution to our cultural problem, Aaron?
Yeah. So that in a way, for me, what happened with my situation, I would say the more hurtful or more frustrating kickback I got wasn't from the like crazed rainbow progressives. I get they're actually even being consistent with what they've been told. It was with the evangelicals who were technically in agreement but disagreeing with the tone. I had to that would be the most chastening thing for me in terms of like I loathe that so much because I know that some are deceived and they're not doing it on purpose always. I don't want to be uncharitable and say all these people are deliberately being deceptive and self-seeking or self-serving. I think a lot of them are, perhaps without realizing. But I think that's just there is something there. I'm sure there are some who just sort of swept along and just think, "Oh, I've been told this is the way we're supposed to be." So almost they have this sort of gloss over how they read the Gospels, for example. So they don't read the bits where Jesus is totally unwinsome, like embarrassingly unwinsome, let alone Paul. And they may also have swallowed this strange distinction between Jesus and Paul. I hear that so often. You get that progressives in theological arguments anyway. Oh, well, Jesus acted like this. Well, that's interesting because Jesus literally sent the Apostle Paul on his way. And when the Apostle Paul, one of the things about Paul's mission is literally going to write all these letters, which are going to say things which are developing what it looks like in practice to be a Christian and to be a Christian church. And some of those things are going to batten down hatches that Jesus himself didn't actually clarify, because the fullness of the counsel of God is being revealed in the canon. And I think this is weird canon within the canon sort of dynamics that go on in these debates, where people just say, well, when I'm confused about it, I just go to what Jesus did or said, only in selective moments as well. And they don't understand that there's so much in the New Testament that is abrasive. And I don't mean abrasive in the sense, you say, Joe, you're right. We don't want to be thoughtlessly aggressive and thoughtlessly abrasive. It's just that it's not, you don't even need to go to Jeremiah and Ezekiel and but because there's plenty there to work with. But probably someone could always say, well, that's an Old Testament capital P prophet, so we don't need to imitate those. I said, well, actually, yeah, we do. And there's no reason why we shouldn't. It's not that we just say, well, that's just a weird narrative event when they challenged the culture, or they challenged the kind of rulers and chiefs, priests of Israel in the way they did. Actually, there's so much of Jesus' fulfilling that prophetic ministry and what he did, and then what the apostles do. And so whenever I've been defending against other evangelicals, this notion of of tone mattering. I've been blogging about this quite a lot this year. I did a 4-part series called On Gentleness and Offensiveness, precisely because I'm really hoping to try to communicate to some of these winsome evangelicals that they're actually reading the Bible wrong quite significantly. And they really think, and so many of them think, that I'm really stupid or really unkind, an unkind, unreflective person, or just spouting my mouth off occasionally. I'm trying to say, literally, really, you have been hoodwinked. You've been hoodwinked by a way of speaking which is very foreign to quite a lot of Christians over most of history. And sometimes it's understandable, because Christianity is not militant in the sense that we're like the Vikings and we're just going to go, right, you're against us, we're against you, we're going to kind of combat you. Obviously, many theologians over church history will have to chastise that militancy when it is a kind of worldly aggression. And Paul does say, we don't fight. We wage the good warfare. We fight the good fight. We don't wage warfare according to the world's weapons, with the world's weapons on the world's terms. But Paul also says we demolish arguments and every lofty opinion that sets itself above the knowledge of God. And you just think most of the evangelicals are constantly saying, mustn't use that kind of language. I think, well, why not? And when I defend it, they say, but you're not the Apostle Paul. I was like, oh, how interesting. So we get to be like the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 13 when he says, just love. We'll read that out at weddings. We'll talk about how love doesn't insist on its own way, therefore be passive and just let the other person win. When Paul says demolish arguments, that's because he's an apostle. You don't get to speak like that unless you're a capital A apostle. Oh, okay. It's just interesting all these weird rules come out that they didn't tell us about. The apostles ought to have told us what we should and shouldn't be imitating, even though Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. And he doesn't, again, add a caveat.
And that's strange as well, Aaron, because if Jesus is the model rather than Paul, well, we're not Jesus either. We're much less. We're certainly not the Son of God. So can we not imitate Jesus or Paul now?
It gets you literally to a place. If you were conspiratorial, you'd be like, is this just their way of gradually unraveling everything in the Bible so that we don't have to listen to anything? Because you even think, I think it might be Ryan who mentioned in the introduction the phrase gentle and lowly. That book,
that's right.
One of the Ortlands, was it Dane Ortland who wrote it? I can't remember which one. And that was being, I haven't read it. I confess I haven't read it. But I was in a Bible study once where it was being discussed. So I partook in a discussion around it. And obviously I heard many reviews of it. And I just thought, even if, of course, there's good stuff to reflect upon about Jesus saying, my yoke is easy, my burden is light, I'm gentle and lowly. But not only is that not the only thing he says, and clearly there's ways of understanding gentleness that we need to be reflected on, where Jesus clearly isn't being gentle and lowly in the way he responds to people who are unrepentant sinners, for example, or false teachers or whatever. But also it was happening in 2020. That was when everyone was reading it. And all of these evangelicals who were already passive, already gentle to the point of being pointlessly saltless and vanilla, are reading this book, go, I so resonate with this. And I was like, really? You resonate with being gentle and lowly because you think this is something you really need to... It's nothing to do with the fact that you're already gentle and lowly and you found a book that's reminding you that this is really important. Now you can hold this up and go, look, it's a biblical. There's a high-ranking evangelical authors reminding us to be gentle and lowly. Everything I already am in my personality and my church, the way we go about things, that's now baptized officially by this evangelical author. I just thought that is just dubious. Even if everything in that book is true, it's dubious that everyone's loving this book at a time when we're supposed to be fighting, and they don't get it, and they're being taught to not fight, and they're being taught that it's foolish and silly to not fight. And so for me, I'm recovering a lot of the need to basically reclaim the more militant tone that we've kind of airbrushed out of the Bible, I think.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I remember just anecdotally that during my time at Cliff, I was asked to give an address towards the end, and I did, and I spoke on a comprehensive faith, and it was quite militant in the right sense, the church militant, and I remember a couple of the professors being very disapproving of even the hymnody that I'd chosen, which included Jesus shall reign, and the notion of Christ's rule and reign. Just those hymns seem to cause some kind of offense, and you're going back 14 years. So that kind of, as you say, that kind of gentle and lowly tone in a kind of misunderstood, kind of bizarre, unbiblical gentle and lowly has been a problem for a long time in the evangelical community. And Aaron, isn't it the case also, though, that this couldn't be more counterproductive in terms of the growth and the significance of these institutions? I mean, the Christian institutions that are moving in this direction across the West, certainly in the United Kingdom, are emptying. The conferences that these institutions have historically put on. I remember the one that Cliff would host annually. There wasn't enough people at the last one to be able to retain the sandwich truck that showed up to serve people. They just drove off because
That's
there was
right.
nobody there. Um, and I've got an inside track on that because I have a family member in the area. So it is bizarre that the very things that are emptying out and actually threatening the very survival of these organizations in terms of student numbers and recruitment and interest in the conferences, the very things that would actually draw students, which is clarity, fidelity, truthfulness. These are the we're moving in the opposite direction, and the effect, the knock-on effect, is the emptying of these institutions. I watched with interest a few weeks ago um, an interview with somebody who I'm not a fan of at all, an Andrew Tate. He's a sort of internet phenomena, with this kind of we would say the kind of militancy that Christians cannot be engaged in. But very appealing to young men, especially because there is this air of clarity and direction and a willingness to come across in a more direct fashion. Well, you're probably aware that he's converted to Islam, and in this interview I was watching, he was being asked about why he'd converted to Islam, and he basically the rub was because I was interested to hear what he was going to say, and I was totally unsurprised by his conversion to Islam. And he said two things, really. First of all, that he realized as he was arguing about these things online that he had no real foundation for his views, this idea of absolute truth and so on. They were floating without a foundation, so he started looking for a foundation. And he commented on the fact that he looked at Christianity in the West, but the problem was the only religion that wanted to fight for anything was Islam, and that Christians didn't want to fight, that they'd given up, and that all of the the woke agenda had swept through their institutions and churches, and nobody wanted to fight, and it completely put him off Christianity. And of course, he's influencing millions of young men. Now, we're not holding him up as any kind of model, but what was interesting to me about it, because I've actually predicted this for some time, is that Islam is going to become more and more appealing to young men in particular, especially fatherless young men in the culture, because it comes across with a degree of clarity, misguided, but with a degree of clarity, with a degree of militancy, that it's prepared to fight for its values, stand for its profit, and so on. And here we have these Christian institutions. We're supposed to be standing for Christ, his lordship, his kingdom. We're soldiers of Christ. We're his ambassadors. We have all this language, the kind of militant language that Paul uses, and athletic language. We're running the race. We're fighting the good fight. It's we drop all of that. We have this humble Kevin Bumble, I'm so humble kind of pietistic retreatism, and our institutions empty. Can you comment on that, on the condition now of these compromised institutions?
Yeah, exactly right. I do echo all those statements about the loss of a outgoing masculine ethos. Actually, in my notes for Pioneer Mission, I used to teach on Pioneer Mission amongst many other things I taught at Cliff, and I used to show an old advert the college used to put up in the 1930s in magazines. They would advertise. They'd say Cliff College stands for as an institution that stands for and impels aggressive evangelism, and by which they meant athletically aggressive, as it were, intentional, front-footed, not passive, going out and bringing people the gospel, and then challenging those things which stand up against the gospel. And it had a little part of it said, if you want 8 enthusiastic men on fire for God to come and visit your town or your circuit, please write to the principal at Cliff College, Carver, at once. And so I used to joke, if you, after this, if you guys want to email the principal and say, can I have 8 enthusiastic men on fire for God, please? Just send. And the college would just send these people, these trekkers, they were called. And lots of colleges did this. It wasn't just Cliff. There are many Bible colleges that used to do this outgoing form. And that shows a confidence in your message. So it's another thing I used to like to say to people. And I think I said this last year when I spoke at this Cliff Festival with hardly anyone in the room. I was saying, look, how do you think we had a Bible college? Why do we have a Bible college sitting on a big hill in North Derbyshire, in Britain, like miles away from Jerusalem? Why do we have churches standing around it? It's because enough people had confidence in their message. Now, what is that confidence? It wasn't the confidence of Islam, which is literally the kind that we are so we're just going to take over and it impel you almost to follow everything we're claiming is true. There is something uniquely different between Islam and Christianity in that regard. There is a gentle lowliness which is different to the message of the Prophet Muhammad, supposedly. And so how we bring that is quite significant. We get confused by this because we then say, well, I need to be gentle and lowly, therefore I should not be confident in my message because I need to look like I'm humble, therefore I shouldn't really be confident in my faith. But that's so stupid. I mean, it's just totally nonsensical because you're really confident in Philippians 2 then, because you just really believe that Jesus made himself nothing, took the nature of a servant, and we need to just be that. So we need to make ourselves nothing all the time and be nothing. But that means you have a lot of confidence in that. So you are actually extremely 100% unhumbly confident that you've read this text correctly. And that's the thing that, yes, your modus operandi for life. And actually, it's a misunderstanding just to take one of those things and then allow that to undermine everything else in that very text. You won't even have Philippians 2 by the end of it. So this unraveling of the confidence in our faith takes place at the same time, as you say, as the growing militancy in lots of other ideologies, Islam being one of them. In fact, I was having a chat with a couple of Muslim guys at my local fish and chip shop. I don't know if you have those across the waters, Ryan, but we have a lot of them here, fish and chip shops. And there were two Muslim guys there. They were oh, you do? Oh, good. Yeah, and they were saying, I was getting into this stuff about woke and saying, we actually agree. I agree with a lot of Muslims in our anti-woke stance. We could have quite a lot of a strange kinship. Not really kinship isn't the right word, but you certainly see things on the same side, and that can be a good bridge building evangelistic conversation, which the winsome crowd certainly wouldn't like to say. We're literally united, or at least we can build a bridge to say, look, we agree on these things that are true. We don't agree on these things, but we agree on these things. And they were saying, we actually totally disrespect Christianity because Christians don't, people say the word Jesus Christ as a swear word all the time. And no Christian says anything about it. Whereas we just about allow them, because obviously Jesus is recognized as a prophet within Islam. So they say we just about allow that because it's in English. If they use the Arabic term for Jesus Christ, that person would need to run somewhere because we don't want to defend it. Now, there's something about the kind of guy who would watch Andrew Tate that would be like, whoa, I really respect that. You actually believe in stuff, you have foundations. And that used to be what Christians believed, even with our good message, which is humble and gentle rather than militaristically aggressive and violent. We had confidence, complete confidence in that message. And so I think the institutions that try to kind of minimize that, it's completely stupid. You're undermining your own foundations. You only need to exist as a church or a Bible college or university because you believe in that message and you want to compel people to come and trust you guys to be faithful stewards of the truth. Why should they trust you if you don't even believe in what you think and what you're supposed to believe? And so that's not to say we should be arrogant and kind of a sanctifying sense of you should be arrogant and just pretend that you're right and true and never show any sense of self-correction or self-reflection. That's not what we're saying. But we are absolutely saying that if you don't believe in your own message, don't expect people to give you money and send people there and continue supporting you. You don't deserve to exist anymore as an institution. And so many institutions are so desperate to protect their reputation in the eyes of some. They've realized it's kind of really foolish anyway. They've not really realized the game's changed, for one thing, and that there's a bit of a shift in culture amongst many movers and shakers who want people to believe stuff, but they've also kind of undersold their own foundations, really.
So
undermine them.
Yeah. So just talk briefly, Aaron, about this counter notion then that you like to talk about being shamelessly biblical. What does it mean as a contrast to this sort of Christian cowardice to be shamelessly biblical? And maybe as you're doing that, um, one of the I read the last few years, I've had an interesting time actually reading a fascinating biography of Kierkegaard, and
Mm,
benefited from reading a number of his works over the last couple of years. A very misunderstood character, a very misunderstood figure, very often
mm.
misinterpreted. Uh, but tell us a bit about being shamelessly biblical, and then maybe one or two insights, because I know you're a bit of a Kierkegaard expert. You've written on him a lot. How does actually Kierkegaard's engagement with culture give us some pointers? Um,
Mm.
because he was not shy about his criticisms of the contemporary church in his time.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Glad to do that. So, yeah, firstly to the shamelessly biblical question, I think that's something that a phrase I've kind of has kind of emerged for me in recent, probably over the last year, as I've reflected. It's probably a culmination of many years of thinking, really, of seeing this winsome crowd within evangelicalism who are known for, if being evangelical for most people means being very clearly demonstratively under the authority of scripture and having that confidence in the gospel that you're going to go and tell people the good news, the evangelion. um, we've developed this sort of weird sense of, oh well, because we care about the gospel, therefore we're not going to care about all these other issues. They're actually attacking the gospel, and we're not defending the gospel at the point it's being attacked. There's that famous apocryphal Luther quote we could go into
Mhm,
about that.
mhm,
But the the shamelessly biblical really refers to um, not being apologetically biblical. Now, I know that apologetics is a discipline that where we talk about in terms of defense, the apologia, and we do need to defend the gospel and defend our convictions. That's different to what I mean by, I literally really mean saying we're sorry. We are sorry. We are apologetic for the Bible. We're sorry that it says this in the textbook, but I guess I have to believe it. It goes, issues like complementarianism are a clear example because it challenges feminism, but arguably complementarianism in how we've packaged it over the last, well, it's a phrase, of course, it's a term that only existed, for half a century or so. It's really a kind of apologetic stance against evangelical feminism um, and egalitarianism. So we kind of then go, right, I'm so sorry that the Bible seems to be really embarrassingly unfeminist. How can we make it less embarrassing? So I don't think certainly wouldn't put all complementarians in that boat. But I just think that there's issues within evangelicalism where even where we hold the line on something, we're sort of doing it in a textbook way, going, well, it says it in the textbook. So how can we find a way around this problem? How can we like undermine this or that? Or how can we at least sort of do the very bare minimum of what the Bible seems to be saying, rather than treating it as God's wisdom, which is a very different way of the saying, well, he said it in the text. I don't understand. I have no idea why God would say this for men and this for women. I mean, don't ask me. He's God, so I'm happy to submit to God. But it's weird. It's a bit like an Abraham Isaac situation. I don't know why he's told me to do it. I'm just going to do it out of pure obedience. Now, amen to obedience when God gives you something that you don't understand. But there's far more that he's given us to understand and reveal to us in his word. And we're often trying to get around it so that no one could have a go at us and call us liberal, because we're technically obeying the text and ticking the boxes, but really we're actually ashamed of it. And there's lots of other texts that we don't even go into that make us ashamed of the Bible. So, of course, I've mentioned there just an issue on gender. You could go into all sorts of other issues where that's the case too. So I'm realizing increasingly, as the world gets crazier in the West, as the ideologies influence um, individuals and societies, and then that creeps and invades the church, creeps into the church, to use the language of Jude. We need a stronger stance that isn't just, I'm so sorry it's here, but here, let me give you a really long, winsome apologia for why it might slightly be feasible to believe this crazy sounding thing. We're just going to be like the Christians of old who literally were, no, this is true, you're wrong. This is bad for you. Don't do this. It's really important that you don't do this. And it's really important that you understand that Jesus is Lord, and he's Lord whether you believe in him or not. He is the Lord. And so that has implications about how we speak and how we talk and the kind of institutions we want to build. And so that's a huge part of recovering what it means to be shamelessly biblical, just not apologizing anymore. And it doesn't mean not reflecting and not being compassionate. I spend a lot of time writing in a way that I hope tries to persuade. We want to be persuasive, but not apologetic for what we believe to be true. Otherwise, go and believe something else. Go and do something else. There's far more interesting ways to live your life if you want to. Playing this half, fast and loose game with the Bible is not worth doing. Go and do something else with your life. Jesus calls us to obey him and to build our house upon the rock of those who hear his words and obey them. So it's about that in many senses. So and Kierkegaard links into that in an interesting way, because he was someone who really was a fish out of water in 19th century Denmark. He's dealing with a sort of corrupted Christendom where everyone thinks they're a Christian because culturally it's the affable, cool thing to do. And I do think those who are fighting helpful and good battles, having good conversations around the issue of Christian nationalism, or whatever term you want to use for it, or Christendom 2.0, etc., that Kierkegaard is an interesting one to look at because he challenges where that can go wrong, when people basically when it turns into something that it shouldn't be. So absolutely, Christendom 1.0 achieved many wonderful things, and we shouldn't be embarrassed by that. That's something that, again, within the discipline I was familiar with teaching within at Cliff, missiology, the post-Christendom narrative was everything. And you almost weren't allowed to ever say that Christendom was good. It was a terrible thing when Constantine got converted. Right. What an awful thing to have happened, because then Christianity got power. We mustn't have power because we're gentle and lowly, don't you know? And as they say, from their position of privilege and power, which is amazing usually. So Kierkegaard, though, is a helpful voice in that post-Christendom conversation, because he's saying, look, here's where it can happen. When everyone thinks they're a Christian, it's actually a good chance that no one's a Christian. Or if they're living in their Christianity out in relation to what's going on culturally around them, they're almost doing what many of the wokeristas are doing today, and just go, okay, right, is this what we're supposed to believe now? Is this what gets you reputable? Okay, I'll be Christian then, or I'll be woke then. So that you had institutions then just basically, paying lip service to Christianity, but not living it out. So Kierkegaard, one of the reasons he gets misunderstood is he's so focused on a subjective faith that it sounds sometimes as though he doesn't believe in objective truth, which he clearly does and demonstrates in loads of ways, because he's absolutely banging that drum of saying, literally, you don't understand the gospel unless it has transformed you personally, and the individual needs to be transformed so that you're not just joining the crowd. So he's dealing with all these sort of 19th century. Think about what's going on in the 19th century and all of the ideologies that are impacting Western culture, and finding their way into Denmark, and what's come before with biblical scholarship and people undermining the text with their newfound Enlightenment ideas. Kierkegaard seeing this creeping in and invading the church, and he's seeing pastors who don't really believe what they're professing, and they're preaching these wonderful sermons, beautifully written in these massive, magnificent cathedrals and buildings with wonderful stained glass windows, and there's a huge congregations, but no one's really living out the radical message of Christ. And radical, I don't just mean, don't care about anything within culture and society. Kierkegaard was extremely well connected to a lot of the ideas and things going on in his society, but radical in the sense of that discipleship where you've really given yourself over to Christ and you're prepared to be called a fool, and prepared to look stupid and non-affable if that should be what society calls you. So Kierkegaard paid the price of that, and was often seen as a bit of a weird extremist in his time, a fanatic perhaps, but maybe not fanatic isn't the right word, because he still would have been seen as like a challenging figure because he was a known intellectual. So I don't know if he'd be quite seen almost like a Wesley would have been seen as just kind of, oh gosh, you're just too religious. I think Kierkegaard, what he wrote certainly sounded very fanatical to some. And he spoke of the martyrdom of misunderstanding, and the way that he's trying to communicate with a mixture of indirect communication and direct communication. So saying, actually, some of you, I can't even tell you the truth straight up, in the way that Jesus sometimes does with parables. So you might write a whole book under a pseudonym with a view that isn't quite his view, but has elements of his view sort of fused within it, to make a point so that someone, one of these sort of effective secular people who's pretending to be Christian, may read it and be challenged in some way. Then he might write a direct book of sermons the same day and publish it under his own name. So he's a weird communicative strategy, a fascinating character. But the main, I would argue, his main thing, it's what I argue in my book, the Taking Kierkegaard Back to Church book that Ryan mentioned earlier. The subtitle of that book is The Ecclesial Implications of the Gospel. So there are implications in our life and for the church of saying that you believe Jesus is Lord. You don't just get to say it and then carry on living this life that's entirely worldly. And so that kind of refined worldliness that was very rife within Europe at that time, especially within a nice place like Copenhagen, where Kierkegaard applied his trade as a writer. His dates are 1813 to 1855, so that kind of first half of the 19th century. One of the famous parables, I'll close with this really, would be that he tells. He told a lot of parables, Kierkegaard. And one of my favorites is, which I bring out in the book, is waddling geese in the pulpit. Well, that's what I've called it. I think it's called the tame geese is the phrase he uses for it. And it's basically that there's this, he tells a story of a church. He says, imagine a congregation of geese. And imagine they're in a church and there's just all these geese. And there's this gander who climbs the pulpit every week, the spiral pulpit up to that wonderful elevated height. And he preaches this grand, eloquent sermon of how these geese are wasting their lives because they ought to be flying and making use of their wings. God has given them these wings that they may fly off to distant lands and adventure. And discover new things and appreciate his beauty and creation and the wide expanse of everything. And then all of these geese applaud this sermon. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Gander. And the gander gets down from the pulpit and they all waddle on home again. And they come back next week again in the same process. They go and listen to this sermon about the use of their wings and they applaud this sermon and then they waddle on home. And then one time someone comes along from outside the church and comes in and goes, hang on, like, aren't we supposed to be using our wings? Isn't that what we're talking about? And they're like, oh, goodness, we don't want to actually do that. We don't actually use our wings. I mean, that would be crazy. Look at the people who use their wings. Look what happens to them. Look, that person got completely ostracized when they use their wings. Look at that person that they're really skinny. They don't get any food anymore. Look at the people who actually are of the grace of God. In living in the grace of God is the people who are plump. They're well fed. Look at the church. The people in the church are very well fed. They look like they're prosperous. But look at that person out there, skinny. Probably this person died, that geese died, that goose died, etc. So the way to do it, really, if you want to get ahead, you need to do what we're doing within the church. That's why Kierkegaard was so aggressively against the church, and he produced a series of aggressive attacks, polemics on them. So not Irenics, polemics against the church, known as the attack upon Christendom, where he's almost saying the only way to be a Christian is to get out of the church because the church has become a kind of building where there's a hospital full of poison and the patients are going in and they're getting worse. They're actually getting worse by being inside the building. So what we need is something that's a purer form of Christianity. Now, you can critique Kierkegaard by the fact that he didn't go probably far enough to build a positive alternative, but he did say, I think he said enough for us to be able to go on. But for me, the key is his deconstructive attack upon false Christianity is a really helpful one for us to hear today, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I particularly appreciated his attack on the philosophical fad of Hegelianism in the church. And it does seem to me that, yes, different time, different era. But again, we pick up the popular fad. The philosophical fad today is critical theory, basically, critical theories. And these are being baptized as Christian in various ways. We've got the Church of England schools, just reading about this week, insisting on teaching critical race theory and all of these things. And this is seen as holiness, piety. And we've got to have people who have a willing to critique and take on these philosophical pseudo-biblical fads that are actually counter-scriptural and actually are like that poison, people going week after week after week and to these churches where they're just taking on poison. Let's close with this question, Aaron, and wrap it up with this before I hand back to Ryan to close us out. But just in a minute or two, we are in a situation now where many of these institutions, the Christian institutions, have been taken over by, if not the wokerati, and the jiggery wokery. They've been taken over by this kind of weak retreatist Irenicism, and it's very difficult for people like you, people like me, to find a place or approval within those kinds of institutions. They don't want to hear from us. They don't want to engage with us for the most part. They don't really even want the debate with us. So have we reached a point where is the priority trying to recover these failing and fading institutions, or is this a moment in our cultural history as believers to be starting new and rebuilding new institutions, creating new opportunities to get past these gatekeepers who frankly, are keeping the faithful out very often? And do we let these institutions die off and create new ones? What's the priority? There may be a bit of a both and there. I accept that, but is there a peculiar priority now for Christians?
Yeah, this is a huge question for our time. For those who get it and who understand the cultural moment we're in, this need to return to Scripture. I think some we're in some kind of reformational moment. We might not need to put a capital R on that, but I think we need to see a shaking up of things. We need to see a return to Scripture, a return to that which really that the authority which is birthed us and on which we stand. And there are many people who technically agree that the really challenging thing we have is when you say institutions. I've had people critique me some of the stuff that I've said, because it sounds like I don't think there's anyone doing good. Well, of course, I think there's people doing good. There's always a spectrum of people who are doing good stuff, or good stuff, and some helpful stuff and less helpful stuff. Sometimes even the people doing good stuff don't realize they're still part of the problem, and that they're not really. It's not going to help longer term. We can never really envisage what the future is going to be, however prophetic we wish to be. But I'm pretty sure that nobody guessed the state that we would be in right now, right? Even 5 years ago, I don't think people would see, right, this situation where we're the kind of voices that are being elevated, and the people who've now got platforms that didn't previously, the kind of ideas that are now being spoken about. We might think of someone like a Jordan Peterson coming along or something, influencing people on the centre right, for example. That wasn't thinkable in people's imagination. So there is a shift occurring, and I think Christians, we do need to err on the side of founding new institutions rather than trying to reform old ones, because I know from experience, having worked in one and worked very closely with the University of Manchester that validated us at Cliff, and working within the University of Aberdeen briefly, and basically knowing lots of people within the theological and ecclesial world. I think I can see that this is a pattern problem, really. And so though I'd be glad for reformation to happen within those institutions, and we could see a great change. And if there are any institutions out there who think, actually, yes, we do need to change, that's great. I'm not going to be, no, we've got to start from scratch, blow it all up and start from ground zero. Absolutely not. If there are repentant, willing ships that are willing to make a change of course, then go for it, and that's great. And praise God if they do, and we can pray that they do. I don't think we need revolution for the sake of it, but I do think we need some reforming needs to occur. So if they're going to change course, they need to change course pretty quickly, and they need to realize that this is a significant issue. I'm not being alarmist, trying to create a false narrative of it's really bad. All of those institutions have shifted to the left in the last 50 years, and they don't even realize it's happened. That's that classic problem of the kind of incrementalism. It's happened in all the denominations and most of the Bible colleges as well. So you better have a very good reason for why you don't think you're going to go the same direction, and you better put some policies, people, doctrinal statements in place and live by them, not just put them on your website, that are really going to show that you're going to not do that. So otherwise, I do think an important, exciting venture of our time will be, right, let's gather people who really do get it, and though we're going to be small and look like a kind of bunch of vagabond bohemians for a while, actually in the long term, I think people are probably going to look at the people who are shamelessly biblical rather than those who are apologetically biblical and half believe or half say everything that they really believe. Because longer term, I think God is going to honor those institutions which are going to be more faithful overtly, explicitly to him, and willing to pay the cost, pay the price of what it means to follow him, follow his words, and live them out faithfully in this world.
Yes, I think it will be the careful, the irenic careful, who will end up writing the histories of the courageous in our time. So, Ryan, thank you ever so much, Aaron. Ryan, over to you.
Yeah, Aaron, thanks again. You're really speaking our language with this approach of shamelessly biblical. It's a pleasure to have you on our platform. We promise to put this up unedited and uncanceled, and really appreciate the your faithfulness and the approach that you've been advocating here today for a recovery of a martial spirit of Christianity. So we're grateful for your time here. Looking forward to having you with us for the conference in November at the Mission of God in the UK.
Mm.
Aaron Edwards, again, blogs at That Good Fight, and we'll put a link in the description. Appreciate your time, brother. From all of us here at the Ezra Institute, we remind you that from him and through him and to him are all things. May God be glorified. We'll look forward to being with you again next week.